Everybody online, how you doing? We're just talking about jungle medicine. So they get sick, and there's always someone in their village that's an expert. Everyone knows a little something about jungle medicine, but there's always someone there that's an expert on everything. And so you go in and say, I've got this weird rash. They've got some tree that they're going to pull something off of, and they're going to take the leaves and they're going to grind them up and turn it into a paste and put it on there. And within a day, it's gone. It's amazing. They've got drinks or berries or salves or soaks. They've got the native plant that Aveeno is made out of. So somebody figured out, hey, this is something that we can put on the shelves for itches. Well, they had it first, and it turned into what they put on the shelves now for itches. So it's pretty amazing. A cashew. Y'all know a nut, right? The nut, cashew nuts. Cashew. I wouldn't make fun of an accent like that. I'm not chasing any chickens or anything like that today. So a cashew nut, each of those nut comes from one fruit that's about this big. And the nut just hangs off the bottom, and it's got a husk on it like a walnut. But you can't just pick it, open it up, and eat it. You have to cook it first, because there is a stink bug that lives inside of each of those husks. And so you've got to roast it first and then break it off and separate everything off of that nut. And then the nut is what gets packaged so that you can eat it. That's why they're so expensive. It's not like it's a whole bunch of nuts that you can shake out of a tree. It's a whole fruit, and they actually can eat the fruit too. So it's pretty amazing. We learned a lot about the medicines and everything on the island. And I always dig that whenever I can pick up any kind of history. I think that's fantastic.
So they roast the stink bug with the cashew?
Yeah, but it separates it out. So the cashew nut actually gets peeled away after everything is cleaned away. And so it's still clean. But yeah, they said that you cannot eat it raw, even though it is okay. That stink bug's going to get you, and it makes everything taste bad. So yeah, that was pretty cool. Pretty cool. So I heard that y'all had a nasty cold front come through.
Yes, you did.
While you and Stacy were swimming on the cruise?
Yeah, while we were at the
enjoying
beach,
sun?
enjoying ourselves. Yeah, we heard all about that. So I'm sorry you had to endure that.
I was on the beach too. It was cold.
See you breathe in your face.
All right, so today we're going to finish up with King David, and then next week we're going to go back into the New Testament. We'll go back to our schedule of one Old Testament story, one New Testament story, until we hit something really interesting again that we've got to spend several weeks on. So as we talk about King David, are there any questions over anything that we've gone over so far?
I think I remember, but at this point, like last week, he's 14, right?
So now he's somewhere between the age of 14 and 30. So this is during the years where he's being trained by King Saul. So he's in the palace with King Saul, and he's still playing his harp for King Saul whenever he has his attacks. And he's also learning everything that there is about palace life. And also he's the armor bearer for the king. So whenever the king goes out to battle, David is the one that's being trained in warfare, and he's the one that's responsible for making sure that the king's armor is ready and fit for combat every time. So this is great learning time for David. And it's that perfect divine timing, because at this point, Saul still does not know that David is the one that's been chosen to be Saul's successor. So in Saul's mind, he's still going to be the king until he dies, and then his son, because he had two older daughters, and then the third in line was the son, Jonathan. And Jonathan was the next successor to the throne. So in Saul's mind, that's how it's supposed to work. But Saul does know that the Holy Spirit has left him and he's being oppressed. And most scholars think that he's actually being possessed by a demon on and off. Okay. And so when he has these fits of demonic oppression or demonic possession, that's when David comes and he plays psalms, godly music for Saul. And since we know that light and darkness can't exist in the same place, whenever David plays these psalms, these godly songs that he wrote, then that demon would leave Saul and he would come to himself again. So that's what's going on during these years. Okay. So that's where we left off with David. He's already beat Goliath, and now Saul has taken him into the palace. So we're still going to use our format that we had before, and we're going to talk about the shepherd on the lamb. I was so proud of myself that I came up with this title because it's funny, but I had to explain it last time. And so being on the lamb means being on the run, and then also shepherd and lamb. So yeah, I had to keep it just for myself. All right, so we're working in 1 Samuel chapter 17. So after David killed Goliath, he went back to live in the palace with King Saul. King Saul had a son named Jonathan, and David and Jonathan became best friends. David also joined the army, and he won many more battles for Israel. All of the Israelites loved David, and they made songs to sing about him. And when King Saul heard these songs, though, he became jealous. He thought that people were starting to like David more than they liked him. They sang, "Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s." Saul was in such a bad mood about it that he asked David to play some music for him so that maybe he could feel better. But while David was playing his instrument, King Saul picked up a spear and threw it at David. He tried to kill David because people liked David more than him. But David moved out of the way and the spear missed him. Saul said he was sorry, blamed it on his bad mood, and then sent David to fight in another war against the Philistines. Saul hoped that David would die in the battle against the Philistines. Now I'm going to stop right here. Notice at this point, it's a little bit different than what it was before. Now, I'm not talking about the fact that Saul's trying to kill David by throwing a spear at him, but now who's going to fight the war for Saul? It's David. Saul's not going out to battle, and the kings are supposed to lead in battle. And so now at this point, Saul is not even acting as a king is supposed to in any way. And now he's just sending David out to fight the battle against the Philistines. But Saul is hoping that David is going to die in this battle against the Philistines. But he didn't. Then Saul said, "David, I want you to marry my daughter, Princess Michal." Now, remember when David killed Goliath, when they were trying to find someone to go kill Goliath, the promise that the king made is he was going to make the person who killed Goliath very, very rich and give him his daughter in marriage, which means a regular soldier then could become royalty by marrying into the royal family. So David was very, very young at this point, and he said, no, I don't want any of that. And so I'm going back home to be a shepherd. But now we have a daughter, Michal, that is offered to him. And all he has to do is kill 100 Philistines. Okay, so this is the bride price. At this point now, David is older. And Michal is Saul's second daughter. The first daughter, the oldest daughter, he already married off to another general. So what David has to do is kill 100 Philistines. So King Saul thought David will never be able to kill 100 Philistines. They'll kill him for sure. So do you think David can kill 100 Philistines? Actually, he didn't. He did not kill 100 Philistines. Instead, he killed 200 Philistines. And so King Saul had to let David marry Princess Michal. Now, this picture is a nice little Lego picture, but we'll have to come back and explain what's going on here. The caption up there is 187, 188. And so David is counting something. So we're going to have to talk about that when we get to the not kid-friendly part. All right. So now we're in 1 Samuel 19. Meanwhile, King Saul kept getting more and more jealous of David. Finally, he told his son Jonathan and the rest of his soldiers to kill David. But Jonathan was David's best friend, and he warned David to run away. David went home, but some of Saul's soldiers came to kill him. Seeing them coming, Princess Michal, David's wife, helped David escape by luring him out the window. Some of the soldiers who liked David more than Saul went with him, and they made their own army in the desert. They would attack Israel's enemies, but they would never attack King Saul or his army. 2 times, King Saul and his army went out chasing David and his mighty 600 so that King Saul could kill him. One time, David and his army were hiding in a cave. King Saul didn't know that they were in there. So he went into the cave to go to the bathroom. King James says that King Saul went in there to cover his feet. He was going to the bathroom. While King Saul was going to the bathroom, David snuck up and cut off a piece of Saul's robe. When Saul walked back out of the cave, David followed him and said, "Look," he showed him a piece of Saul's robe that he had cut off. "I could have killed you today, but I didn't. Why are you trying to kill me?" Another time, Saul was glad that David hadn't killed him and said again that he was sorry for chasing David and trying to kill him. He said that he wouldn't chase David anymore, and he went home. But a little while later, Saul got out to chase David again. He took his army and he tried to kill him. This time, when it was dark and everyone was sleeping, David snuck in to Saul's camp, and he took Saul's spear and his water jug. And I didn't write it out, but again, he goes out of the way. Saul wakes up. David starts smacking on his water jug and says, "See, I snuck into your camp. I grabbed your spear and I grabbed your water jug. I could have killed you again, but I didn't." And again, Saul repented of trying to kill him. And it's really weird the way that they said it. So Saul would, I think what's going on is whenever the demon would possess Saul, that's when he would go out and try to attack David. Then the demon would leave him, and Saul really would give a heartfelt, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Why? I don't even understand why you are repaying my evil with your good." And finally, after this point is when Saul even says, "I don't deserve to be king. I see that you are the anointed one." And so even at this point, when Saul is saying, I know that you're going to be the right king. But then the demon would oppress him again, and he would still go back to doing all of the evil things. So it's really interesting what goes on, and it's really entertaining. So if you go back on your own and read 1 Samuel 17, and just start there at 1 Samuel 17 with David and Goliath, and then go all the way to the end of 1 Samuel, which is 1 Samuel 31. It is a really fun read, everything that's going on there. So when David was sent out to kill the 100 Philistines, Saul wanted proof. And so what he asked David to do was to go out, kill 100 foreskin or 100 Philistines for their foreskins. So he had to prove that he killed them by bringing back body parts. So when we go back to that photo, see if I can go back a whole slide at a time. What he's actually counting there, 197, 198, 199. He's actually out there in front of King Saul, counting out the soldiers' foreskins that he cut off as proof that he killed not 100 Philistines, but 200 of them. Now, this is a bridal price, because what David said is, I'm just a shepherd boy. I don't even deserve to marry your daughter because she's a princess. And usually, again, David's raised now in the palace, so he knows how things work. So usually the princesses are married off to a prince of a foreign warring country in order to try to broker peace between the countries. And David knows how this is supposed to work. And he says, so why do you even offer her to me? I am just a shepherd. And so it was all just a ploy. Saul had no intention of marrying off Michal to David. But David was strong, good looking, smart, able to beat giants in battle, not to mention all the other soldiers now that he's generaling and taking whole armies out and just wiping everybody out. If you look in the back of your paper Bibles where there's maps, you can actually see what Israel looked like in King Saul's time. And then by the time David has taken the throne, Israel has grown tremendously because David is going out and taking all of this land every time he goes out and beats another army. And so when David is in charge of Israel, when he becomes king, he actually continues to grow it. He unifies the kingdoms. And so now Israel and Judah are now one large kingdom again, and continues to press out not only against the Philistines to the south, but also the Edomites to the east, and then moving up north into Assyria. And he's wiping them all out. David really was gifted by God to lead his people in the way that God truly intended for him to lead. So that's what's going on there. Now, when we get to our, but wait, there's more, guy. What I wanted to do is take this into a little bit of a different direction and spend some more time talking about this relationship that David had with Saul's son, Jonathan. If you've ever read that story before, it's a fantastic story. So the story of David and Jonathan is a perfect example of how best friends are supposed to relate with each other throughout their lives. Now, modern day blasphemists try to make their relationship, David and Jonathan, much more than friendship. So to make things clear, it was much more than friendship. So let's talk about this. It's the idea of covenantal friendship. Okay. It's a weird word, covenantal friendship. So the key to their relationship, and this is what you can say to those that think that this was a homosexual relationship. It absolutely was not. It can be found in 1 Samuel 18. After David had finished talking with Saul, this is right after he killed Goliath, he met Jonathan, the king's son. There was an immediate bond between them, for Jonathan loved David. Now remember, this is not written originally in English. Okay, this is Old Testament. So what language is it in? Hebrew. Okay, so this is written in Hebrew, and English is a silly language in many ways, but one of the biggest reasons it's silly is because our words really don't mean much. And so we have to add helper words to them. You know, I like that, or I like that a lot. I like that very much. I like that so much. And so we have to add all of these words in order to make like mean something more. Hebrew is not that way. Hebrew has different words for different strengths of words. Okay. An example here is love. This word that Jonathan loved David is not the Hebrew word for romantic love. This is the Hebrew word for brotherly love, like twin brother love, that kind of close sibling bond that you could only get if you've been together since the beginning. Okay, so it even says in another place that David loved Jonathan much more than he could love a wife. Again, that's another thing that those blasphemists are saying, that means he was homosexual. It's not. Again, it's the wrong word. It's the Hebrew word for brotherly love. And it actually turned into the kind of love that was, I don't care what you do, I'm still going to love you anyway. Okay. Like the Greek word agape. Okay. That unconditional love. It doesn't matter what you do, I'm going to love you anyway. So that's the kind of love that we're talking here. Verse 2, it says, from that day on, Saul kept David with him and wouldn't let him return home. Now, it was for Saul's benefit, but it was also for Jonathan's benefit. Jonathan probably said, Dad, I want to keep him. Can we keep him, please? Okay. It was that kind of thing. And Jonathan made a solemn pact with David because he loved him as he loved himself. Jonathan sealed the pact by taking off his robe and giving it to David, together with his tunic, his sword, his bow, and his belt. Now, what is the significance of all of that? Who's Jonathan? He's the king's son, right? He's the prince. What kind of robe and tunic and sword and bow and belt do you think he has? Royalty. It is the best. And so Jonathan gives all of this as a gift to David, showing David, you deserve this. You deserve the royalty. It was a pact. And that's what turns this into a covenantal friendship, a covenant, a pact. It's like a blood oath. Okay. This is a big deal. So verse 5 says, whatever Saul asked David to do, David did it successfully. So Saul made him a commander over men of war. A weird choice of words because he didn't say soldiers. Why do you think it's written this way? How old is David? 14, 15, maybe. And Saul turns him into a top general over men that have been fighting wars for 20 years, 30 years. This little kid is good at, I almost said strategery. That's a nice George Bush word there, isn't it? So an appointment that was welcomed by the people and Saul's officers alike. So what this is telling us is that he gets made commander in chief. David's in charge of everybody and nobody's angry with it. They're all liking it. Not just the soldiers, the officers, but all of the people. They all see God's blessing, God's hand, and the Holy Spirit on David. Okay, so the pact, as the New Living Translation phrases it, was actually a contract. So I'm going to look at Gary a little bit because he's going to know. He's going to do like this. Whenever we do easements or leases, a contract, you have to have special language in that contract that says, me, the grantor, is going to give you, the grantee, this stuff. But the words that have to be in there is for $1 and other valuable consideration. Well, now some of them say for $10 and other valuable consideration. In order to have a contract in Texas law, which actually comes a lot from Old Testament law, there has to be consideration. There has to be something given in exchange. If there's nothing given in exchange, it's not a valid contract. And so what happened here is Jonathan says, hey, you're my best friend. It's not, oh yeah, we're friends, okay. And then you grow apart from each other and you may see each other 30 years later. This is deeper because by Jonathan giving him the robe and the tunic and the belt and the sword, that's now a contract. I'm your best friend and it's going to stick forever. And if I fail, then I have to suffer a consequence. And the consequence for breaking a contract sealed with a sword is to be killed with that sword. Think about that. Don't ever give anybody a weapon and then make them mad because that gives them right to kill you. Okay, in Old Testament law. So this was a contract. So the fact that Jonathan gave his robe, his tunic, his belt and sword, this was symbolic of Jonathan recognizing David as the next king. This is the prince that was going to take the throne. And he's recognizing David as the one who's going to be next to take the throne. And this is showing that Jonathan feels that his friendship with David is more important than any potential rivalry that is going to happen between his father and David. He shows this again by warning David in code that Saul is going to try to kill David. Do y'all remember the story? David and Jonathan are just chilling, and David tells Jonathan, you know, your dad's tried to kill me several times. And Jonathan's like, no, he wouldn't do that. He tells me everything, and he hasn't said anything about that. And so David's like, no, for real. So the next time that you go into the planning meeting with your father, the king, just listen closely. And he's going to tell you that he's going to go out and kill me. And if he does, because at this point, David's already on the run. At this point, he says, now, if he is planning to kill me, when you come out to practice your archery again, if you fire 3 arrows into the target, then I know that your father's not planning on killing me and I'm just making this all up. But if it actually comes out that your dad is going to take his army against me, I want you to send one of the arrows past the target and then send your servant to go get that arrow. And so this all plays out. Jonathan comes out doing his archery practice, sends 2 arrows right into the target. 3rd arrow misses the target, goes all the way beyond. And David then, after the servant goes to get the arrow, comes back and says, see, I told you. And Jonathan says, I wouldn't have believed it had I not heard it for myself. And at that point is when David then takes his small army and he starts heading out to the wilderness. He actually goes out and he and his army settles in the land of Gath. What did I say about Gath? That's where Goliath was from. Good. So he's in the land of the Philistines. And so what happens, and I love this story, David and his men then go and live in Philistia, where the Philistines are from. Saul is going to war against the Philistines all the time. David just walks in there and says, hey, Saul's trying to kill me and my men. Can we come here and help you? The Philistine king says, sure, come on in. And so they go and they settle in the land of Philistia. And so David goes to the Philistine king and says, hey, we're going to go on a raiding party. And the Philistine king says, where are you going to go? And he says, oh, we're going to go destroy your enemies to the east. And so David will go and take his army off to the east, and he would start hacking away at remote Philistine outposts. And he was just tearing up the Philistine army, and he would kill every soldier, kill them all, so that none of them would be able to report back to the Philistine king, this guy that you let live with us is killing us, right? And so David just goes out every day and just dwindles the Philistine army down a little bit more, a little bit more. They didn't have cell phones to give any reports. And so David was taking care of all the Philistines without the Philistine leadership even knowing. So what happens by the time that King Saul is no longer king, David's pretty much wiped out most of the Philistines. And he did that all while living with the Philistines. Pretty smart. Pretty smart. So by the time we get to 1 Samuel 20, Saul has figured out that Jonathan is letting David know what's going on. And so Jonathan is no longer allowed in the planning meetings. So he's ostracized by his father. So David's part of this pact was that Jonathan nor his descendants would ever be enemies of David, because that was tradition. If one king comes in to conquer another king, the conquering king is supposed to kill all of the descendants of the first king so that they would not have a chance to regain the throne. Okay, so David makes a promise that Jonathan nor his descendants would ever be enemies of David. And David even makes this oath to King Saul. That time that David sneaks into the camp and takes Saul's spear, which was right by his head, stuck in the ground, all David had to do is just pick it up and go. And instead of doing that, he just picks up the spear, picks up the jug of water, heads back out. And when he bangs on it and wakes Saul up, Saul again says, why are you repaying my evil, trying to kill you, with good? I see that you're going to be king and you are a righteous man. And David says, I would never attack you because you are the anointed one of God. David is still calling him the chosen of God. As a matter of fact, I will never harm you, and I will never harm your children forever. And so he made that same pact with Saul in 1 Samuel 24. And scripture shows us that David kept this oath even after Saul and Jonathan die in battle. 1 Samuel 31, it really, I mean, with such a great character that Jonathan is, in 1 Samuel 31, verse 1, it just says, yeah, Saul and his sons went out to war against the Philistines, and Jonathan and his two younger brothers were killed. And then it just goes on. That's all it says. Jonathan was just killed in battle during this war with the Philistines. And then what happens during the battle is that Saul gets mortally wounded. He's wounded enough that he knows that he might die. But he also knows that before he dies, most likely he's going to be captured by the Philistines. And he knows what they do to anybody who's captured, and they torture them relentlessly. And when they find out that he's the king, they're going to make sport of him and turn him into a trophy, going back into Philistia. And so this guy is walking by, and Saul says, hey, I need you to kill me so that I'm not captured by the Philistines. And the guy is like, no, I'm just walking through. I don't want to have anything to do with this. No, really, I am the king. I am ordering you to kill me. He says, I'm not part of your kingdom. You can't order me. I'm leaving. And so the guy takes off. No one's there to kill Saul. And so he falls on his own sword and he kills himself that way. The guy goes to David and says, King Saul's dead, and I killed him since you're his enemy. And David says he mourns that Saul and Jonathan are dead. And the guy, he just says, well, since you admitted out of your own mouth that you killed God's anointed one, go ahead and kill him. And one of his own guys just lops off his head. He shouldn't have admitted that he did something that he didn't do. So that's another moral of the story. Don't take credit for something that you didn't do, because it might have unforeseen circumstances. So the guy lost his life for doing something that he didn't even do. Saul took his own life. So that's how 1 Samuel ends. And 2 Samuel starts off with King David and his rule as king. So next time we're going to talk about a recipe of how to feast on locusts and wild honey. So who are we going to be talking about?
John.
Who's that?
John.
John the Baptist. Yep. Next Sunday, we'll be going New Testament again, spending some time talking about John the Baptist. So any questions about Jonathan or David or Saul?
A fashion question.
Yeah.
What's a tunic?
So think Greek, like do the Greek toga parties.
Toga?
Okay. So the skinny shoulder length tunic,
The best with the skirt.
vest with the skirt attached is a tunic. Okay. So they still had all of their wrappings, their loincloths and everything underneath that.
Kind of what
And
Goliath looks like in a lot of his pictures.
Goliath, he's wearing his war leathers though. Goliath is. So at this time, they would have a wrapping of underclothing, an undershirt. Then they'd have a tunic that would be a cotton or linen, since he's royalty, a linen tunic that would go over that. That would be girded with a belt that he would hang things on, swords and bags of money and things like that. Then there'd be another robe that would go over that. That would be tied with another rope. And then they'd have their turban that would have another rope on top. So a lot of layers. And you're thinking, how are you going to survive with all those layers? Those layers were all designed to wick your sweat away from your body. And as that sweat would move away, it would cool you. As the wind would take the wet away from the cloth, it would cool you. So that's how they still dress in the desert. all those layers in order to stay cool. Okay, good question. Anything else? All right, cool. That is it for today.
Steve, have you ever seen Raid of the Lost?
Which one? The old one or the new one? I have. Yeah.
You never trust that man in the suit. That's all I can think about the whole time. And that's why I was like, that's what.
That'll work. Goodbye, everybody online.